Hello there. For those who don't know me, I'm John Gibson and I work in the strategy and planning team here. Earlier this year, we commissioned a short piece of research that looked into entry barriers for small businesses to online markets, and it focused especially on the role played by organisations such as search engines and payment providers and market platforms, who in some ways could be seen to be playing the role of gatekeeper to market in some cases. So research was published earlier this month, and in doing so we asked small businesses to give us their views on the kind of problems that they faced when trading online. And all of this is very timely at the moment, given the complaints that are buzzing around the ether about Amazon's price parity policy and Google's search results rankings and other things. So it's a good time to be thinking about these kind of issues. The research itself was done by two companies with expertise in these areas, Plum and Kepler, and they're going to talk to us today about their findings and then answer any questions that you have. So without anything further, I'll hand you over to Brian and Stephen, who I think are going to do the talking.
Thank you. I'm Brian Williamson from Plum Consulting, so I'll start. Right. The first slide is just the terms of reference, which was to bring an understanding of online markets, describing the routes to market of SMEs wishing to trade online, and commenting a little on the economics of these markets. So that is what the report does. It provides context for consideration of any complaints, and that was mentioned. And the findings are based on three things: our industry knowledge, a literature review, and there is a very limited literature on these things. There's lots of literature on things that touch on it, but not directly on this issue. And interviews, and we interviewed some of the platforms, Amazon, eBay, PayPal, IMRG, and all the large industry participants, and a number of SMEs. And for the SMEs, you'll find case studies in the report about their experience. The findings, we'll start with the findings rather than end with them, and we'll end with some questions. And I think you can kind of look at this in two parts. There are clearly, we think, some substantial gains from the development of online markets and these services they provide to SMEs. So there are new opportunities. Some of those just weren't possible before. And the Apple App Store is an example where an SME could develop an app, and that just wasn't possible 2 years ago. Lowered entry costs. Many of the services that are provided to SMEs are free or at low cost on these online platforms, so it definitely lowers entry costs compared with setting up a store on the high street, say. There is ongoing innovation in relation to the platforms. It's not an entrenched position that any of them have. There's continuous change and potentially disruption from changes, and we'll talk about that later. We see quite a bit of evidence of the opening of platforms to third parties, which I think is very interesting, particularly given that some of these platforms, in terms of, have quite large shares of the market as it is defined at the moment, perhaps, and they're still opening. So Amazon have, for example, allowed third-party sellers on their platform, and there are many other examples. And during the study itself, there were a number of news items about platforms opening up to third parties, both to sell and to innovate adjacent to the platform. Boundary between online and offline is blurring. What do we mean by that? Well, it's not simply a case of somebody looking for information, for example, by going to stores and then buying the same good or service online. The opposite happens as well. People get information online and then buy offline. And in future, with smartphones and devices like that, I think this distinction will also blur further. You might, for example, go into a store, compare the price with an online offer. You might buy online when you're out shopping and actually pick up the purchase from a store, some combination of these things. So it's a much more complicated picture, and that will have implications for competition, both offline and online. And there was one interesting factor that came up here, which is one of the issues that SMEs have a concern about is fulfillment, the delivery of the goods to the customer. partly because there's a lack of competition and because that's a big problem for customers if they have to stay at home, for example, in a pickup window. And online may be spurring competition in these offline services because the online platform can offer people choices about how it's delivered, which encourages competition. So that's interesting. On the other side, we record these concerns. They're not necessarily concerns we had, they're just the things we found out about concerns that different stakeholders have. The first one is supplier restrictions on online trading of goods. And this supplier restrictions is not new to online, but it appears to be quite prominent in relation to online, and we think that's because of the visibility of the terms and the pricing online, which make it easier to police these sorts of terms. And we don't make any judgment about whether this is good or bad, it's just an observation and it's a concern that some have in the market. Platforms engage in consumer protection. They do that for very good reasons, but at times that can be disruptive for an SME if, for example, a payment isn't allowed and then the transactions might be held while that's sorted out. So consumer protection can lead to errors, obviously. System changes. Search rankings are complex. Some SMEs depend on those rankings, and if the algorithms change, then the rankings can change. That can have a big impact on businesses. Obviously, the impact will be good for some and bad for others, but the ones who are impacted negatively may complain about that, so that's an issue. And then there's the Google vertical search case, which is a current case. So we think the gains have been very large, but stakeholders identified various concerns in relation to these markets. This is just to give some sense of perspective. The UK, we don't do much in the way of comparative data in the report, but the UK has a fairly active online environment, particularly compared with other European countries. Compared with the US, the left-hand side is retail sales as a percentage of total retail sales. So it's now sitting at about 7.5% of retail sales. And according to this data, it's higher than the US, although I think this is still a provisional ONS series. So whether the definitions are identical, I'm not sure, but they're fairly close, I think. On the right-hand side, we have three size categories of firms. This is data on the percentage of private sector turnover in each category. Now, given that the story we're telling says actually this has significantly lowered entry barriers for SMEs, I thought it would be interesting to look at what the aggregate data tell you about SMEs. And I think they tell you it's kind of in the noise in terms of the aggregate effect. So there are probably winners and losers. You can imagine that's the case, that some SMEs that might have been bricks and mortar in the past may be pushed out of business by online. Others have new opportunities. So overall, you don't see a change really in the distribution, size distribution of firms. So I just thought that was an interesting point. Okay. And I'll hand over to Stephen.
Good, thanks, Brian. I'm going to say a few words about how online markets work by different area. So if you think about online markets from the perspective of an SME, there are various different activities involved. And here is an overview that we framed our thinking by developing a taxonomy of these different activities. I'm going to talk through the overview now and then come back to each of the areas in more detail. And starting at the top, oops. Sorry, I was trying to get a pointer, but I don't think that's going to work. But if you start on the top left, we kind of sequentially went through the different activities that an SME might engage in to trade online. And the top one is web presence. So that's developing a website or some other kind of presence on the web. The next one is marketing and brand, so that's promoting the website or the business. And those two things are common to nearly all SMEs who want to participate in online markets. And then there are two other areas. One is payment and security, and the other one is fulfillment, by which we mean the warehousing and distribution of goods. And those two areas, they are specific to those companies who wish to retail online, to sell online, and to distribute those goods to their clients. So this whole framework does vary enormously depending on what kind of SME you are talking about. Now, for each area, there's a very discrete set of suppliers. You can see, for example, in web presence, there's 3 different sorts of suppliers involved. But what's interesting here is there is one set of suppliers that kind of span the whole range of activity here, and those are what we call the online marketplaces. And those are eBay and Amazon and various other similar companies, and I'll come back to talk about those in more detail later. So starting at the top with web presence, this is essentially the online equivalent of building a bricks and mortar store or other retail premises. And what we found in this area is that barriers to building a web presence are low and they're continuing to fall. And if you think back a few years, to develop a website would have required some technical knowledge, and if an SME did not have that technical knowledge, they would use a professional developer. But there have been several innovations in this area. I'll give you a few examples, but essentially these things have made it very easy for an SME to develop a website. So starting at the top left, there are now free or low-cost online website development tools. So these are essentially services